It's been 14 years since the 9/11 attacks. On this anniversary, I'll ask former Afghan President Hamid Karzai whether the so-called war on terror has made the world a safer place. I'm Mehdi Hassan, also on the show. Why do young men and women turn to terror? That's our debate in the arena with one of the few experts who's actually sat down and talked with Al-Qaeda and ISIL fighters across the world. But first, the United States responded to the 9/11 attacks by invading Afghanistan and toppling the Taliban. 14 years later, that country remains plagued by violence, and there's even talk of a comeback for its controversial former president who left office last year after a decade in power. This week's headliner, from Kabul, Hamid Karzai. Hamid Karzai, thanks for joining me on Upfront. You left office exactly a year ago, with civilian casualties in Afghanistan at a record high, with opium production, drug production at a record high, with the Taliban resurgent across vast swathes of your country. Many would say that is evidence not of your success as president, but of your failure.
Well, the rise of the Taliban, increased violence in Afghanistan, and narcotics, these are exactly the three issues for which Afghanistan has very little responsibility. The Taliban were a force, no doubt, who belonged to Afghan villages and Afghan towns, but they were raised outside of Afghanistan and funded from outside of Afghanistan. That's why the United States came to Afghanistan to fight them. So we should look at the broader international scene on that. Civilian casualties, unfortunately, very high, which was one issue of tremendous friction between me and the United States. That is true.
But the vast bulk of the civilian casualties were the responsibility in recent years of the Afghan Taliban inside of Afghanistan. It seems quite easy for you to be able to say it's not Afghanistan's responsibility, but it was Afghan insurgents killing fellow Afghans under your watch.
These casualties were conducted both by those who came from outside in the name of the Taliban and other terrorist organizations who killed Afghans, and also was the responsibility of the United States and NATO forces.
The United Nations says 3 out of 4 Afghan civilians killed last year were killed by Taliban or other insurgent fighters. Let me ask you about civilian casualties more broadly. It's the anniversary of 9/11. Do you believe the so-called war on terror launched by the United States and its allies after 9/11 in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iraq, do you believe that made the world a safer place?
Well, to come back to civilian casualties and figures, those figures were done by the United Nations. That's largely a Western organization. So I have my experience tells me to doubt those figures. I can tell you as much that there were casualties in Afghanistan so big and so horrific that we could not tolerate. Now, with regard to the United States arrival in Afghanistan after September 11, that arrival of the United States and its allies in Afghanistan did bring us liberation from a creeping invasion from outside, from one of our neighbors, namely Pakistan, and the terrorist groups associated with it and funded by it. So we are grateful for the United States and its allies and the rest of the international community for bringing that liberation. But no, the presence of the international forces in Afghanistan and of the United States in Afghanistan and the region did not bring security or defeat of extremism. Rather, we see more of it.
Given you've repeatedly called the Taliban, controversially called the Taliban, your brothers, let me ask you this. If they're your brothers, did you send them your condolences when you heard about the death of their leader, Mullah Omar? Or did you celebrate his death, as many Afghans I'm sure did, given how many innocent Afghans Mullah Omar killed?
Well, my philosophy for life is that I never feel happy for the death of anybody, even if that person has caused me personal harm, or even if that person has caused harm to our country. Therefore, I neither celebrated Mullah Omar's death nor did I send him a condolence. I wish the Afghan Taliban, who are truly from this country, who are not in the hands of a foreign force, would come back to their own country and would help rebuild Afghanistan and bring peace.
You mentioned Afghan Taliban fighters versus foreign fighters. Obviously, Al-Qaeda was the main reason that the Americans said they were going into Afghanistan and not the Taliban. Are you still of the view that Al-Qaeda is more of a myth than a reality? It's what you said last year. You also said you weren't even sure that they existed. Really?
Exactly, that's my view today as well.
That Al-Qaeda is a myth?
It is for me a myth. I have never had a report from any Afghan source on the Al-Qaeda or what they were doing. We don't see them. We cannot visualize them. For us, they don't exist. I've never had a report from our intelligence. I've never had a report from our people. I've never come across them. So for me, it's a myth.
On September the 11th, 2001, was Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan?
I have come across the Taliban. I've come across other groups. I don't know if Al-Qaeda existed and I don't know if they exist. For me, it's a myth. I have to feel tangible about it before I can say they are there. Well, reports say they are there, but I have no information per se.
Your allies in the US government, NATO forces on the ground in Afghanistan, all said that they were there fighting Al-Qaeda fighters. When you say it's a myth, you've not seen any evidence, did they call you a conspiracy theorist? Some might say you sound like a conspiracy theorist.
Well, if saying that something does not exist does not mean a conspiracy. It's my judgment, it's my feeling. Maybe they are there, but I have not seen them and I have not had a report about them. Any report that would indicate that Al-Qaeda is operating in Afghanistan. And I've also been in conversation with various American officials. The last one that I had was last year, in which they told me that there are perhaps not even more than 30 to 35 individuals. So if that's the entire strength of an organization, for me, that's a myth.
So just to clarify before we move on, do you believe
in Afghanistan.
Do you believe Osama bin Laden carried out the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. and plotted them from Afghanistan?
That is what I have heard from our Western friends. That's what the Western media says. There is no doubt that an operation was a terrorist operation was conducted in New York and in Washington. The tragedy of September 11 is a true one. It caused casualties to the American people, to civilians. We condemn it in the strongest possible words. But I can tell you for a fact that that operation was neither conducted from Afghanistan, nor were the Afghan people responsible for that.
You do believe or you don't believe that Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan were behind the 9/11 attacks, as is the view of the US government and other Western governments?
I neither believe nor disbelieve something that I don't know about. I can tell you that Afghanistan was as much a victim of terrorism as was America, as were the people who were killed in the September 11 terrorist attacks.
On ISIL, which is the current terrorist threat that many people talk about, quote unquote, this militant group, insurgent group, terrorist group, has many names. ISIL, Daesh, they're believed to be in Afghanistan now too. And you said earlier this year that there is a foreign intelligence agency supporting ISIL. That's a pretty provocative statement. Can you tell us which foreign intelligence agency?
That's not a provocative statement. That's a true statement. ISIL or Daesh, we know is operating in Iraq and has risen out of the circumstances in Iraq and Syria because of the foreign intervention there, because of the desperation of the Iraqi and Syrian people there, because of the desperation of a part of society there. That's there. But ISIL in Afghanistan has no ground here at all. There is no element, there is no medium for them to grow
so which
or
agency,
to rise
Mr.
or to
Karzai?
strengthen.
Which agency? The
Taliban
ISI?
are a fact in Afghanistan.
Which agency? You referred to a foreign intelligence agency
Well,
behind
just
ISIL.
a second, please. We know for a fact that in our province of Nangarhar, which is to the east of the country, which is bordering Pakistan, those who are working in the name of Daesh are definitely Pakistani militia forces. This has come to us from the Afghan people from those villages. Some of them have been captured, and ID cards found on them. Definitely, according to the people that I've met in the past 4 months, they are Pakistani militia forces, and they're very well supplied. That we know for a fact.
Mr. Karzai, you left office a year ago after 10 years as an elected president. You were leader before that as well in a transitional administration. How do you go from being two-term president of a war-torn country like Afghanistan to being a private citizen? What do you do now? How do you pass the time?
Well, I'm a very happy retired president, Mr. Hassan. I spend my day generally in meeting people, in engaging people, in attending conferences, in going to events, national events and other events. So I have a pretty busy life, but I have a happy life. And I'm glad that I'm in my own country.
There are some people who say that in your retired life you've become a bit of a backseat driver, that you're undermining the new President Ashraf Ghani's policy-making abilities despite promising to stay quiet. You've publicly criticised the Memorandum of Understanding signed in May between the Afghan and Pakistani intelligence agencies. You've carried on meeting with world leaders like Vladimir Putin. Many would say that it isn't your job to do that anymore. Why carry on behaving like a head of state? You're not a head of state anymore.
I'm not a head of state anymore, but I'm a citizen of Afghanistan, and where I believe certain fundamentals of Afghan interest are threatened by any internal or external element, it's my job as the citizen of Afghanistan to speak about it.
Although you did say in March of this year that I will keep mum and give advice to President Ghani in private. You haven't done that, have you? You've given your advice quite publicly.
On a lot of issues I've done that, and I have told President Ghani about that even before we swore him in, that I will not be interfering in any other issues of the government, and I want you to be a strong president. But where I see that the sovereignty of Afghanistan and the unity of Afghanistan are threatened, then I will speak out. I have already conveyed that to him, and I will do it in the future as well if a thing like that ever happens. I hope it will not.
And are you ruling out a return to office? Will you ever be president of Afghanistan again?
I'm ruling that out in absolute terms.
You will never be president of your country again?
Definitely not. I want this country to move forward, to be a flourishing democracy where the Afghan people will have a happy life, a peaceful life, and a prosperous life to the extent that our country and our circumstances allow.
Let's hope that happens. Hamid Karzai, thank you for joining me on Upfront. War, what is it good for? Well, when it comes to defeating terrorism, not much.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
Ah, the good old war on terror, which started with such grand ambitions. Yet after 14 years, $4.4 trillion, hundreds of thousands dead, is the world any safer? Has the war been won? Not quite. Between 2002 and 2014, the US government estimates that deaths from terrorism went up by 4,500%. If that's winning, I wouldn't want to see losing. Take Iraq. Before the invasion in 2003, there were no recorded suicide attacks in that country's history. None. Since 2003, 1,892 suicide attacks, killing almost 20,000 people. One Al-Qaeda strategist went as far as to say that the war in Iraq almost single-handedly rescued the jihadi movement. You may have heard of ISIL. It didn't exist on 9/11. Just saying. If you're still not convinced that all the so-called war on terror has given us is more war and more terror, check out Afghanistan. Insurgents killed 2,643 Afghan civilians last year, the highest number since UN records began. And remember, the Taliban was supposed to have been defeated back in 2001. Then there's Pakistan.
There's more extremism today in Pakistan than ever in our history.
In the 14 years before 9/11, there was one suicide attack on Pakistani soil. One. In the 14 years since, 486 suicide bombings, causing more than 6,000 deaths. And the story is tragically the same in Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Nigeria, and Syria, where the situation is now so dire that you'll never believe who the former head of the CIA has apparently called on for help against ISIL. Yep, Al-Qaeda. Full circle, full failure. The British government confirmed this week that it killed two of its own citizens, Rayad Khan, 21, and Ruhul Amin, 26, in drone strikes in Syria. But what makes seemingly integrated young men and women from the West go out to fight and die for groups such as ISIL? Can it all be blamed on religious beliefs? I'm joined in the arena by Professor Scott Atran, an anthropologist and author of the book Talking to the Enemy, who spent a great deal of time in the company of actual Al-Qaeda and ISIL fighters. Also joining me in the arena is Dr. Sebastian Gorka, a counterinsurgency expert and chair of military theory at the US Marine Corps University. Welcome to the arena, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks.
Scott Atran, you've met a lot of these so-called jihadists, these violent young men out in the field. How do you explain how someone, or why someone like Rayad Khan, a straight-A student who once said he wanted to be Britain's first Asian Prime Minister, how does someone like that end up in Syria fighting and beheading on behalf of one of the world's worst groups, ISIL?
Well, it's a glorious, adventurous, countercultural movement to which people project their frustrations, their frustrated aspirations, and problems they've had in life. You know, I was interviewing some guy who wanted to blow up the American embassy in Paris, and I asked him, so why'd you want to do this? And he gave me the whole spiel about the oppression of Muslims everywhere, but I said, why did you want to do it? And he said, you know, I was walking down the street with my sister, the Boulevard République. We were just window shopping. She had a hijab, and she wasn't looking where she was going, and she bumped into an elderly Frenchman who spat and said, Sale Arabe, you dirty Arab. He said, then I knew. I said, but there's always been racism. He said, yeah, but the jihad didn't exist. So it's an attractor for all these grievances and personal frustrations, and search for significance and glory among youth, especially in transitional stages in their lives.
Sebastian Gorka, what do you make of this line of argument from Scott?
I think it's utterly fallacious and absurd. You just have to listen to the jihadis, listen to their leaders, read their documents, listen to their speeches. The idea that we're facing a bunch of adrenaline junkies who could be dealt with by bungee jumping is, of course, absurd. I mean, even the anecdote, Scott's anecdote, is perfect, right? What does the guy answer? But we didn't have jihad. It's not excitement. It's not thrills. It's holy war. This is the context. The thing about the anthropological world, and especially the social scientists in general, is that they don't take religion seriously. They don't take history seriously. They don't have theological understanding for what is actually driving people to violence.
Scott? Fallacious, absurd.
I don't know what he's talking about.
Clearly.
Yeah.
That's the problem, because
do you take them, he's saying you don't take them seriously when they say it's about religion.
No, of course I do. I mean, you know, I go into the field. I am an anthropologist. I've written books about religion. And we find two predictors that can determine willingness to fight and die. One is fusion with their friends. 3 out of every 4 people who joined the jihad, whether it was Al-Qaeda or now the Dawla Islamiyya, the Islamic State, do it with their friends, about 1 in 5 through their families. There's very little recruitment. They're mostly self-seekers at the beginning. The second independent predictor is sacred values. It's not ideology per se.
Sebastian, let me ask you this. You said people don't take the religious element seriously as these violent fighters do. There's a French hostage called Didier Francois, who was an ISIL hostage. He says about his interactions with his captors, there was never really any discussion about texts. There was never a religious discussion. It was only a political discussion.
You know, this is why you see the videos from Chechnya, the videos from Kashmir. These are the things that light the spark. But again, why are they doing it? Scott said it himself, for the glory. But for whose glory? My glory? No, God's glory.
Scott, God's glory.
For eternity, yes. But if you dialogue with these people, if you look how they actually move into jihad, which is what we do, it's very interesting. There is very little discussion of religion, although in the background it is very important in terms of motivating people to bring them together from all walks of life, rich, poor, smart, dumb, to come and fight for a common cause.
Is there any socioeconomic involvement here? A lot of these guys are from fringes of society, the Kouachi brothers in Paris, that has no relevance whatsoever?
Yeah, but it has the relevance in a very interesting way. Jihadi ideologues, if you want, they come to these petty criminals and say to them, look, you can do something significant in life. You can be glorious. For yourself, for your friends, for your community. And the people we find dying more and more and willing to take suicide actions, for example, are from these petty criminal elements.
Just like the 19 hijackers, right?
No.
Just like Bin Laden, just like Zawahiri, just like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi,
Well,
like all the fighters
let's
that
take
had
the
left.
hijackers.
You know,
I actually talked to all
Jihadi
their
John, right?
Well, I actually talked to their families. You know, here's the way it happened with the hijackers. So they're all from the Levant, and they're living in Harburg, in a suburb of Hamburg. And they're sort of doubly alienated. I mean, they're not Moroccans and they're not Turks. And they walk around and they don't do anything in mosques. You can't ever do jihad in mosques. You do it afterwards. You do it in fast food restaurants. You do it in universities. First they wanted to go to Chechnya, and then they realized no one's going to let them in. Then they wanted to go to Bosnia, and the Bosnians said, well, do you know how to fight? They said, no, we'll get us some Russian night goggles. And then they met somebody on the train who had a beard and said, why don't you come to Afghanistan? They fell in Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's lap, and he said, look, boss, look what's fallen into our hands. So it wasn't any kind of recruitment. It wasn't any kind of well-planned operation, and that was the best plan.
9/11 was not a well-planned operation. Are you serious, Scott?
No, no. In terms of the guys themselves.
How they ended up there.
Yes. And all of the other plots we followed, and we've followed every plot since then, most of them are pretty half-assed.
You mentioned Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's considered the ringleader or chief plotter of the 9/11 attacks. You talked about listening to what they say. If you're on the right, you might say, listen to the religious ideologues. Listen, they're saying it's about God. On the left, they'll say, no, it's about US foreign policy. Both sides hear what they want to hear. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, according to the 9/11 Commission report, was supposed to have landed his plane, had he been on one of the planes, had he managed to get on the plane, on a runway and given a speech denouncing US foreign policy, denouncing Israel. Does that mean Israel and US foreign policy is to blame in the same way? If we're going to take them seriously, why cherry pick from their quotes?
All I can tell you is you go to the primary sources.
Yeah.
I had the honor to serve as an expert on the Tsarnaev trial, right? So the Boston bombers. They gave me all the documents on his hard drive. And it wasn't videos of bungee jumping. It wasn't adrenaline junkie stuff. It was absolutely scores of nasheeds. It was 2,000 pages of religious jihadi justifications, and mostly
justifications. So you justify it using religious language.
Absolutely.
But what actually gets you to that position where a young kid from Boston, who all his friends said was perfectly integrated, wants to kill them?
Looking for meaning. Looking for purpose.
Aha, so we found some common ground.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Looking for purpose.
And of course, when he was found in that boat, I believe, he'd scrawled all sorts of attacks on US foreign policy, I believe.
No, he'd actually scrawled, I look down the barrel of your gun, Kufr, and I see heaven. It's about religious justification and glory of God.
Look, he followed his brother, his big brother. It's a Chechen brother. His mother's half crazy. His father's not around. He really didn't know much about anything. His brother was really into this stuff.
Not what the court decided, not what the jury decided.
Okay, I'm President Obama, I'm Prime Minister Cameron. I come to both of you. I give you a piece of paper. Write down for me 3 things that I'm not doing that I should be doing to stop young men like the Tsarnaev brothers, like Rayad Khan, from turning up in a training camp.
You have to attack them at their center of gravity, and that's their claim to authenticity and their ideology, and you have to delegitimize them. So they are using religion. They're using a very powerful 7th century narrative. Just listen to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's speech from the Grand Mosul Mosque. You have to say, hang on guys, he says he's fighting for Islam. Who are the majority of his victims? Not Jews and Christians. It's actually fellow Muslims. Right now, from the streets of Paris to Raqqa to Dabiq, jihad is sexy. We have to destroy that brand.
You sound like you're agreeing with Scott again. Scott's nodding. Scott, what would you do? What advice would you offer?
As you said, Sebastian, it is a very sexy thing. I mean, when you're at the front, you see the Islamic State didn't even exist 2 years ago, right? Now they control 12 million people, hundreds of thousands of square miles, and they are not being degraded at all. And the reason is because they have a spiritual force. But the spiritual force is not just an abstract ideological force. It is something that bonds people into camaraderie, values that bond them and give them this sort of elan. Now, how do you attack that? Well, that has to come from within their world, not from within ours. Or you destroy it physically.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Scott Atran, Sebastian Gorka, thanks for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.